got to interrupt that now because the opposition leader Tony Abbott has begun this media conference on the Gold Coast. He's at a landfill station there.
Parliamentary colleague, it's good to be here with Tom Tate, the new Mayor of the Gold Coast. I want to thank him for what he's been doing to help lead local opposition to the carbon tax. Now, behind me is the Reedy Creek landfill. It's one of the big waste disposal centres here in southern Queensland, and this is going to be the focus of costs for Gold Coast City Council and Gold Coast ratepayers. Council calculates that just paying the carbon tax on their landfill sites is going to cost something like $4.3 million every single year. Now, councils right around Australia are trying to urgently calculate what their carbon tax liability is. This has suddenly been dumped on them by the federal government, which is producing panic and chaos in local councils which don't know exactly how much they're going to have to pay. But this is typical of the current government, which always does things late and without proper forethought. And what we're faced with at the moment is the most incompetent government in our history trying to administer the most complex tax in our history. Is it any wonder that Australians are worried? Now, from July the 1st, which is less than 4 weeks away, Australians are faced with this carbon tax. It's going to be a python squeeze rather than a cobra strike, but it is going to hurt from day one. And as time goes by, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And the only way to fix it is to change the government. The only way to save Australia from this carbon tax is to change the government, because the first act of a coalition government will be to start the carbon tax repeal process. We've had more boats over the last few days. We've had 3 boats in just 4 days. The government has completely lost control of our borders. The government should start governing. They should stop acting like an alternative opposition, start acting like a real government, and a real government would swiftly put in place the policies that have been proven to work. That means rigorous offshore processing at Nauru. It means temporary protection visas, and it means the option of turning boats around where it is safe to do so. These are the policies that worked under the Howard government, and the only reason why this government can't put them in place is because the current Prime Minister is too stubborn to admit that John Howard had it right. Now, I'm going to ask Karen just to say a few words, because it's good to be here on the Gold Coast, which is very much her political territory. Then I'm going to ask Tom to say a few words as the Mayor who is wrestling with this toxic tax and how to cope with a toxic tax which is being imposed on his council and so many other councils, and then I'll take a few questions. So, Karen?
Thanks, Tony. It's great to welcome you back here to the Gold Coast for what is your 3rd visit in just over 12 months. So it's terrific to have you here and to have you clearly supporting us here on the Gold Coast and demonstrating that we have a lot to offer, and the Coalition is certainly behind everything that we're doing here on the Gold Coast. Gold Coasters deserve a fair go, and we do not get that from this government. We have faced rising costs of living over the last couple of years, and it's just going to be exacerbated by the carbon tax. The landfill site here, and the Mayor will speak much more about that, is going to be hit with the carbon tax, and it is going to result in some serious dollars that the council has to come up with that it hadn't budgeted for. So we're looking at well over $7 million per year that the carbon tax is going to hit the Gold Coast City Council with, and that has to be covered. What we need is for the government to understand that on the Gold Coast we have suffered for some time with the downturn in the construction and the tourist industry. What we need to do is start these industries here on the Gold Coast. We don't need another hit which will put us further behind. We need business confidence to be able to grow here on the Gold Coast. We don't need further tax hits.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Tony. Very welcome to our city. We turn a beautiful sunshine for you. But on this part about the carbon tax, ladies and gentlemen, we haven't budgeted for it. It's going to add another 3% onto our waste levy. Our councillors and myself had decided not to put it on the levy because my faith is in the Liberal National Party government that the carbon tax will be repealed. People are hurting out there and we can't afford to increase our rates any further. And you see, under our budget at the moment, every single levy has been capped except for this waste. So we're going to cap it and not pay for it because I believe that 12 months is a long time for a Julia Gillard government and they won't be there. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, do we have any questions?
The latest opinion poll has the coal opposition doing really well, but on a personal note, you're down. Is that the voters telling you that they're unhappy with your negative approach?
Look, every day I'm telling people how the next coalition government will get taxes down. What could be more positive than getting taxes down? And the best way to get taxes down is to scrap the toxic carbon tax, which will be the first act of a coalition government. We get taxes down, we'll get spending down. That can take the pressure off interest rates. So that's a very, very positive agenda. And I'm out there every day with that message. Tax reform begins with scrapping the carbon tax. Look, I think that it's very important to maintain standards of parliamentary integrity and plainly members of parliament who don't tell the truth to the parliament, members of parliament who misuse money which is not their own, that's not contributing to standards of parliamentary integrity, and it's important for the opposition to stand up for decent standards, and that's what we will do every day.
The polls suggest Malcolm Turnbull has twice your level of support as leader. Is that frustrating?
Look, I just think it's terrific to see that he's doing such a great job. He really is doing an outstanding job in exposing the waste and the mismanagement behind the National Broadband Network, which is a $50 billion plus white elephant from a government of proven incompetence and untrustworthiness.
Do you think you have an image problem? Are you going to work on trying to soften your image?
Every day I'm out there holding a bad government to account and promoting a positive alternative. Tax reform begins with scrapping the carbon tax, and there can be no more positive thing for Australians right now facing serious cost of living pressures getting rid of the carbon tax.
Tony Windsor's called for a release of the entities which are going to be hit with the tax, so I take it you'd support that?
Well, we've been calling for this now for at least 12 months. The Prime Minister promised back in July of last year that within days the list would be released, but frankly, this is a government which just doesn't know what it's doing. One of the reasons why it can't explain itself is because it just does not know what it's doing. And this is why Australians are so bereft of confidence right now, because the most incompetent government in our history is now trying to implement the most complex tax change in our history. And the latest victims are the 104 councils right around our country who've been hit with a letter demanding that within 2 weeks they assess their carbon tax liability over the next 40 years. Well, this is the kind of bizarre conduct that you get from a government which is simply incompetent and untrustworthy.
The Queensland government's announced it's going to crack down on the King's motorcycle gang. This sort of thing's been happening across the country. Do you support the states getting tough on these biker gangs?
I think it's very important that the state governments do what they can to ensure our streets are safe, to ensure that criminal gangs are cracked down upon, and of course I think that Campbell Newman is absolutely right to target gang activity.
Is there anything that can be done at a federal level in relation to that?
Look, one of the things which the federal government has monumentally failed to do is control our borders, and not only have they failed to control our borders where illegal boat arrivals are concerned, they've failed to control our borders where illegal handgun importation is concerned. They have cut $60 million from border screening, Under the Howard government, more than 60% of arriving air cargo was screened. It's now under 10%. Is it any wonder that handguns are getting into our country?
The Australian Federal Police is shutting their office on the Gold Coast and relocating to Brisbane. Given that this is a hotbed for bikers, is it sensible to send the AFP up the road to Brisbane when we do anything here?
Look, I think it's important that we have strong law enforcement agencies, and that means that we've got to have a strong presence on the ground, and that's what it is the government's duty to deliver.
Regarding the carbon tax, isn't it the case with landfill sites where they generate electricity, though there won't be a liability?
Well, it is completely confused exactly what the liability of councils at the moment is, and that's why there is so much doubt and fear in councils right around Australia right now. Councils know that ratepayers are suffering. Councils are very reluctant to hit ratepayers with swinging increases, and yet they fear that they might have to because of vast and very difficult to quantify carbon tax liabilities stretching out over the next 40 years. And this is typical of an incompetent and untrustworthy government that at the last minute it makes these sorts of demands on other bodies. Is it any wonder that even inside the government itself now there are increasing calls for the carbon tax to be rethought, but it's very hard for them to rethink the carbon tax without rethinking who their leader is, and this is why the Prime Minister is under so much pressure.
Mr Abbott, do you agree with the Treasurer's proposal that Australia is in a fairly strong position to weather any global financial crisis in the future?
I think that Australia's economic strengths owe far more to the reforms of previous governments than to the spending spree of the current government. Now, these are very perilous economic times. The international economic storm clouds have rarely been darker, and yet what does this government do? It chooses to damage Australia's competitiveness, to damage Australia's productivity with the world's biggest carbon tax. This is the worst possible time to be introducing the world's biggest carbon tax, and yet this is a government which is so ideologically driven, so enslaved to the Greens who foisted this tax upon them that they feel they've got no option. Thank you.
Okay, so that was the opposition leader, Tony Abbott, live from the Reedy Creek landfill station on the Gold Coast. He says there's panic and chaos in local councils with the carbon price due to come in the next month or so. We haven't heard yet from the Prime Minister's office yet where Julia Gillard is today. The government has maintained the vast majority of people will be adequately compensated for any price rises from the carbon tax.